The rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the cracked sidewalks into rivers of grime and discarded memories. Beneath a flickering street lamp, a figure lay curled under a thin, tattered blanket, his form barely discernible against the damp concrete. His name was Daniel, a man forgotten by the world, a man whose life had unraveled like a frayed rope, thread by agonizing thread. His breath fogged the night air as he shivered, pulling the blanket tighter against the biting cold. The city bustled around him, yet he was invisible. People passed by, their eyes fixed on their destinations, their hearts hardened against the sight of another lost soul. But not everyone ignored him. A small shape hesitated at the edge of the street, its tiny paws sinking into the mud. The puppy was no more than a few months old, thin, ragged, ribs pressing against dull fur. Yet despite its frailty, there was something unbreakable in its stance. Its tail flicked nervously, its ears perked, and its dark, round eyes remained locked onto Daniel. Watching, waiting, the man barely noticed at first, too lost in the rhythm of his own suffering. But when he shifted, the dog flinched, a movement so slight, yet so filled with hesitation, as though it had spent its short life expecting pain. Daniel sighed. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection countless times. The puppy took a hesitant step closer. Then another. "Go on, get," Daniel muttered, though there was no real force behind his words. The puppy didn't move, it just stood there, ears drooping slightly, looking at him with something Daniel had long stopped expecting from anyone: concern. A lump rose in his throat. No one worried about a homeless man. Not the world, not strangers, not even those who once claimed to love him. And yet, here was this trembling, abandoned creature, staring at him as if he were the most important thing in the world. The rain poured harder, matting the puppy's fur, but it still didn't leave. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Fine," he grumbled, "if you're dumb enough to stay, I guess I won't stop you." The puppy took this as an invitation and, before Daniel could change his mind, crawled forward, curling against his side. Its tiny body was so cold, so fragile. Instinctively, Daniel adjusted his blanket, pulling just enough to cover the little thing. For the first time in what felt like years, warmth bloomed in his chest. Morning came sluggishly, dragging gray clouds across the sky. The city was waking, but Daniel remained still, afraid to move, afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled beside him. The puppy stirred first, stretching its tiny limbs before nuzzling deeper into his side. Daniel looked down at it and sighed. "Guess you made your choice, huh?" The puppy yawned in response, its pink tongue curling. Shaking his head, Daniel sat up and ran a hand through his tangled hair. "You got a name, little one?" Of course, the dog didn't answer, but there was something in its eyes, something too knowing for a creature so young. Daniel hesitated before murmuring, "How about Lucky?" The puppy tilted its head. "I mean, not sure how lucky you really are, ending up with someone like me." He chuckled bitterly. "But you survived out here, just like me. That's gotta count for something, right?" Lucky wagged his tail, a tiny, hopeful flick. And just like that, Daniel knew he wasn't alone anymore. He didn't know where this road would take them. He didn't know why this tiny, abandoned soul had chosen him. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The city was waking. Car horns blared, hurried footsteps echoed against the pavement, and the scent of fresh-baked bread from a nearby cafe teased Daniel's empty stomach. He pulled his thin coat tighter around himself, shielding Lucky from the damp morning chill. The little puppy was still curled against him, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. For a moment, Daniel just sat there, listening to the rhythm, Lucky's breathing. The distant chatter of pedestrians, the world moving forward without him. Then, hunger clawed at his insides. Daniel's stomach let out a low growl, and as if in response, Lucky stirred, lifting his head. His dark eyes met Daniel's, full of trust Daniel wasn't sure he deserved. "Well, kid," he muttered, rubbing his face. "We gotta eat." Lucky perked up at the word, tail thumping softly against the damp sidewalk. Daniel sighed. He had no money, hadn't in days. Normally, he could last a little longer. But now there were 2 mouths to feed. He glanced at Lucky's frail body, the way his ribs pressed against his skin, and made a decision. The dog would eat first. Pushing himself up, he slung his tattered backpack over one shoulder and tucked Lucky into the crook of his arm. The puppy let out a small whine but didn't resist. Daniel had been on these streets long enough to know where to look. The first stop was an alley behind a diner, one he knew threw out its leftovers in the morning before the lunch rush. He moved quickly, avoiding the judgmental glances of passing strangers. It was something he had long since grown used to. People didn't see a man in need, they saw a problem. Lucky, however, didn't seem to understand. As they walked, his little head poked out from Daniel's coat, watching everything with wide, curious eyes. A woman in a business suit gasped when she saw him, and for a brief moment, her expression softened. But then she looked up at Daniel, at the mess of his unshaven face and the frayed edges of his coat. And that kindness disappeared. She walked on. Daniel didn't react. He had stopped hoping for kindness a long time ago. The alley was empty when he arrived. A relief. He set Lucky down, whispering, "Stay." The puppy obediently sat, ears twitching. Daniel rummaged through the dumpster carefully, ignoring the stench. He knew what to look for: unopened packets, food still wrapped, anything not soaked through. His fingers brushed against something solid, and he pulled out a slightly crushed takeout box. Inside were cold fries and half a burger. Jackpot. He turned back to Lucky, ready to share the meal, only to find the puppy staring at him, tail wagging eagerly. Daniel knelt, breaking the burger in half. "Here, kid, you first." But Lucky didn't take it. Instead, he sniffed at the food, then nudged it toward Daniel with his tiny nose. Daniel blinked. "No, buddy, you need it more," Lucky whined, but when Daniel insisted, the puppy relented, nibbling at the food. Daniel forced himself to eat the rest. Despite the guilt curling in his stomach, Lucky deserved more than this. They both did. That night, Daniel sat with Lucky tucked beside him, the city buzzing around them. Despite everything, he felt lighter. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone had chosen him. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, just because. Lucky had nothing, yet he still tried to share. Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. He wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be. The wind howled through the alleyways, weaving between the crumbling buildings like a ghostly whisper. The city never truly slept, but the night brought an eerie stillness, an emptiness that settled deep in Daniel's bones. He sat with his back against a graffiti-covered wall, knees drawn up, Lucky curled tightly against his chest. The tiny puppy shivered despite being wrapped in Daniel's coat. "It's colder tonight," Daniel muttered, rubbing Lucky's back. "I should have found us a better spot." Lucky let out a soft whimper, pressing his little body closer. Daniel's fingers trembled as he held the dog tighter. His body had grown used to the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless ache of the streets. But the cold was different. The cold could kill. A gust of icy wind swept through, and Daniel clenched his jaw. Lucky needed warmth. He needed shelter, and Daniel had nothing to give. By midnight, the cold had become unbearable. Daniel knew he couldn't stay there. Not if he wanted Lucky to survive. He forced himself to stand, cradling the puppy against his chest. His legs were stiff, his hands numb, but he pushed forward, heading toward the only place he could think of, the old bus station. It wasn't much, but it had benches, a roof, and sometimes, if luck was on his side, a heat vent near the back wall. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few late-night stragglers. Some walked past him without a glance. Others pulled their coats tighter, as if afraid his poverty might be contagious. He ignored them. Lucky shivered against his chest. "Almost there, kid," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the dog or himself. When he reached the bus station, relief flooded his chest. The place was deserted, save for an older man sleeping on a bench, his face hidden beneath a hood. Daniel moved to the far corner, where he knew the heat vent would be. But when he got there, his heart sank. The vent was off. No warmth, no safety, just cold metal and the bitter wind seeping through the cracks in the walls. Daniel slumped down onto the bench, pulling Lucky closer. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The puppy lifted his head, licking Daniel's chin. His tiny tail wagged once, weak but insistent. Daniel let out a shaky breath. Even now, when they had nothing, Lucky still found a way to comfort him. He couldn't let this be their life forever. Something had to change, something had to give. As he closed his eyes, shielding Lucky from the wind, a silent promise formed in his mind. He would find a way. For both of them, Daniel barely slept. The cold gnawed at his bones, and every gust of wind felt like knives against his skin. His arms stayed wrapped around Lucky, shielding the tiny puppy as best he could. But the truth clawed at his mind. This wasn't enough. Lucky wouldn't survive another night like this. Daniel wouldn't either. As dawn broke, gray light spilling into the empty bus station, he made a decision. He had to do something he hadn't done in years. something he had sworn off after too many nights of being ignored, insulted, or worse. He had to beg. Daniel made his way toward the heart of the city, Lucky tucked inside his coat. The streets were already alive with people, men in expensive suits, women with shopping bags, workers rushing to beat the morning rush. He found a spot near a busy cafe, hesitating for a long moment before slowly lowering himself onto the sidewalk. Lucky peeked his tiny head out, tilting it curiously. Daniel exhaled. He had no sign, no cup, no words. Just a silent plea in his tired eyes. People passed, some glanced at him, their expressions flickering with something close to pity before they looked away. Others didn't bother to look at all. The minutes stretched into an hour. His stomach churned from hunger. Then, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a little girl, no older than 6, clutching her mother's hand. Her wide eyes locked onto Lucky, and her face lit up. "Mommy, look, a puppy." Daniel tensed. The woman barely spared him a glance before tugging the girl away. "Don't stare, Emily." "But, Mommy, we don't talk to strangers." Daniel lowered his head. Lucky let out a soft whimper, sensing his pain. Another hour passed. The cold pressed deeper into his skin, and Daniel was just about to give up when... Clink! A coin landed on the ground beside him. He blinked. Then, a second clink. A few crumpled bills. Daniel looked up. A man in his late 30s stood before him, dressed in a neatly pressed coat. His face was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Lucky. "What's his name?" the man asked. Daniel swallowed. His throat was dry, but he forced the words out. "Lucky." The man nodded, then crouched down. "You're taking good care of him." Daniel hesitated. Was he? Before he could answer, the man stood and walked away, leaving behind enough money for a warm meal. Daniel sat frozen for a moment, disbelief washing over him. Then he looked down at Lucky, who wagged his tail. They would eat today, but this wasn't enough. It was time to take a bigger risk. Daniel had to find a way off the streets, for both of them. The weight of the few crumpled bills in Daniel's hand felt heavier than it should have, like hope wrapped in paper. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for food, enough to last another day. Lucky licked his fingers as if sensing the shift in his mood. Daniel exhaled. He wouldn't waste this. He found a small corner shop a few blocks away. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Lucky still tucked into his coat. The warm air hit him like a wave, thawing the numbness in his fingers. The cashier eyed him warily. Daniel ignored it. He moved to the back, picking up a small loaf of bread and a bottle of water. He hesitated before grabbing a can of dog food too. At the counter, he counted out the bills carefully, his hands shaking slightly. The cashier said nothing, just took the money and handed over the bag. As Daniel turned to leave, a voice stopped him. "Hey." He looked up. It was a woman, a customer waiting behind him. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a neat, dark coat, her sharp eyes scanning him. "You're feeding the dog before yourself," she said. Daniel stiffened. He didn't know what to say. The woman sighed, then reached into her purse and pulled out a $5 bill. "Here, get yourself something warm." Daniel blinked, stunned. He wanted to refuse. Pride, even in the worst of times, was a stubborn thing. But Lucky licked his chin. And Daniel swallowed his pride. "Thank you," he whispered. The woman gave a small nod, then turned away as if she hadn't just changed his entire day. Daniel found a small bench in a park and sat down, unwrapping the bread. He tore off a piece for himself, then opened the can of dog food. Lucky's tail wagged wildly as he dug in, his little body trembling with excitement. Daniel smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't much, but for now, they were okay. But he knew this wasn't enough. Tomorrow, he needed a real plan. He needed a way off these streets. For both of them, the city stirred to life around them, but Daniel barely noticed. He sat on the park bench, rubbing his hands together for warmth, staring at the last piece of bread in his palm. Lucky was curled up beside him, his belly full for the first time in days. But Daniel knew that wouldn't last. The few dollars he had left weren't enough to keep them going. And the streets were merciless. He had seen too many people fade away under their weight. He wouldn't let that happen. Not to Lucky, not to himself. Daniel adjusted Lucky inside his coat and stood. He had no real plan, just an idea. A desperate one. He walked toward the city center, toward the places where people with jobs and lives bustled past him, too busy to see the world he lived in. But he wasn't looking for money this time. He was looking for a chance. The first few places shut him down before he could even ask. "No hiring. We don't take walk-ins." "Sorry, man, not looking for help." With each rejection, the weight on his chest grew heavier. Then, just as he was about to give up, he spotted a small diner at the edge of the block. It wasn't fancy, just a place with faded signage and scratched-up windows. But inside, the smell of coffee and fried eggs made his stomach twist with longing. He hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. A bell jingled as he entered. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with tired eyes but a kind face. Daniel swallowed his nerves. "Excuse me," he said. I don't have a resume or an address. But I need work. Anything. Cleaning tables, washing dishes. He glanced down at Lucky, still tucked in his coat. "I just need a chance." The woman studied him for a long moment. Daniel braced himself for another rejection. But instead, she sighed and set down the coffee pot she was holding. "You ever worked in a kitchen before?" Daniel nodded quickly. "I used to wash dishes a long time ago." The woman hummed. "You on anything?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "No." She gave a short nod. "All right, you work one night. No pay. If you do good, we'll talk." Daniel's breath hitched. "A chance. A real chance. I won't let you down," he said. The woman just shrugged. "We'll see." Then she pointed to the back. "Clock in at 5, and don't bring the dog in the kitchen." Daniel glanced at Lucky, his chest tightening. The woman sighed again. "He can stay in the break room. Just don't let him cause trouble." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hope bloomed in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward. The smell of frying bacon and sizzling butter filled the tiny diner as Daniel scrubbed dishes under the dim yellow light. His hands, rough from years of living on the streets, worked methodically, scraping off dried food, rinsing each plate, stacking them with precision. It felt strange, almost unreal, to be in a warm place, surrounded by people who weren't hurrying past him or looking at him like he didn't exist. But he couldn't get comfortable. This was his one shot. He couldn't mess it up. Lucky was curled up in the break room, nestled inside Daniel's coat. The old woman, Maria, as he had learned, had grumbled about not running a dog shelter but hadn't kicked him out. For that, Daniel was endlessly grateful. Still, he checked on Lucky every chance he got. The pup always lifted his head when Daniel peeked in, his tail thumping weakly against the fabric. It gave Daniel just enough strength to push through. Hours passed. The dinner rush hit hard, plates piled up, the air thick with steam and grease. Daniel's back ached, his fingers pruned from the soapy water. But he didn't stop. He barely spoke, just focused on working. At one point, Maria passed by, pausing at the sink. She didn't say anything, just watched him for a moment before tossing a rag onto the counter. "Take 5, she said. "You look like you're gonna pass out in my sink." Daniel hesitated. A break meant stopping, and stopping meant thinking about how fragile this moment was, how easily it could slip away. But Maria was already walking off. And the truth was, he was exhausted. He sat in the break room, pressing his forehead against Lucky's tiny body. The warmth of the puppy's fur steadied him. Lucky stretched and yawned, his pink tongue curling before he nuzzled against Daniel's chest. Daniel closed his eyes for just a second. He hadn't felt this safe in years. "Hey!" Daniel's head snapped up. He hadn't meant to doze off. Maria stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His heart lurched. Was she going to fire him? But instead, she held out something wrapped in foil. "Eat." Daniel blinked. It was a sandwich. Slowly, he reached out, his hands shaking. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. "Thank you," he whispered. Maria grunted. "You did good tonight." Daniel swallowed. "Does that mean I can come back?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at Lucky. Then, with a sigh, she muttered, "Be here tomorrow." 5 o'clock sharp. Daniel barely held back the emotion rising in his throat. This wasn't just a job. It was a second chance. For him, for Lucky, for the first time in a long time, tomorrow didn't feel so hopeless. Daniel barely slept that night. Even with Lucky curled up beside him, warm and safe, his mind spun in endless loops. He was still in the back alley behind the diner, wrapped in his thin blanket. But everything felt different now. He had a job, a real chance, but with that chance came a new fear. What if he messed it up? What if Maria changed her mind? He had been given hope before, only to have it yanked away. He couldn't let that happen again. Lucky stirred beside him, yawning. His tiny body stretched before he wiggled closer, pressing against Daniel's chest. Daniel ran a hand over his fur, exhaling slowly. No matter what, he wasn't alone. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, Daniel was already up. He washed his face in a gas station bathroom, smoothing his unkempt hair with wet hands. His clothes were still worn, but he did his best to make himself presentable. Lucky padded after him, sniffing at everything with curiosity. Daniel picked him up, cradling him in his arms. "Today's important, buddy," he murmured. "We can't mess this up." Lucky licked his chin in response. Daniel smiled faintly. At exactly 4:55 p.m., he stepped into the diner. Maria was already there, wiping down the counter. She didn't say anything, just gave him a look before jerking her chin toward the back. "Clock in." Daniel nodded quickly. He was in, for now. The evening rush was worse than the night before. Plates piled up in a never-ending cycle, the clatter of dishes and the sizzle of the grill creating a chaotic rhythm. Daniel worked faster this time, his movements more precise. His arms ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every time he felt himself slowing down, he thought of Lucky waiting for him in the break room. Of the life he wanted to build. Of the chance Maria had given him. By the time the crowd thinned, Daniel felt like he had been run over. He flexed his sore fingers, leaning against the sink for just a second. Maria appeared beside him, a mug of coffee in hand. She set it down next to him. Daniel blinked at it. "You," he hesitated. "For me?" Maria rolled her eyes. "No, for the dishes. Drink it before I change my mind." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. The warmth seeped through his fingers as he took a careful sip. It wasn't great, bitter and slightly burnt, but it was the best thing he'd had in ages. Maria watched him for a long moment. "You work hard," she finally said. "Most people in your position don't last a night." Daniel swallowed. "I don't have a choice," he admitted quietly. "It's this or..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Maria sighed, rubbing her temples. "I need someone reliable," she muttered. "You screw this up, you're out. But if you keep doing what you did tonight..." She paused, then huffed. "We'll see." Daniel's throat tightened. She wasn't offering him a promise, but she was offering him a chance. And that was more than anyone had in a long time. As Daniel finished cleaning up for the night, he peeked into the break room. Lucky was curled up in his coat, sound asleep. Daniel smiled softly. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, new struggles, but for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something more. For himself, for Lucky, for a future. Daniel sat on the cold pavement outside the diner, Lucky curled in his lap. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city winding down for the night. The stars barely peeked through the polluted sky, but they were there, small pinpricks of light, reminding him that some things, no matter how faint, refused to disappear. Tonight had been good, better than he expected. Maria hadn't kicked him out. The customers barely noticed him, and for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, even if it was just a cramped kitchen full of steam and grease. Lucky nuzzled against him, warm and trusting. Daniel stroked the puppy's fur absently. "I think we might make it, buddy," he murmured. But as soon as he said it, doubt crept in. Every time he had started to believe in something, it had fallen apart. Every time he had trusted someone, they had let him down. Every time he had tried to build a life, it had been ripped away. Lucky licked his fingers, breaking him from his thoughts. Daniel exhaled, gripping the puppy just a little tighter. No, this time had to be different. He had to make it different. A shadow from the past. Daniel hadn't seen Mark in weeks. Not since that night at the shelter. Not since he had left him behind, walking away from the only friend he had in the world. He told himself it was for the best. Mark had his demons, just like Daniel had his own. But guilt still gnawed at him. So when he saw a familiar figure slumped in the alley across from the diner, his chest tightened. Mark. He was hunched over, his back against the brick wall, arms wrapped around himself for warmth. His clothes were even filthier than Daniel remembered. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. Daniel hesitated. He could keep walking, pretend he didn't see him, pretend the past wasn't clawing at his heels. But then Mark shifted, and for just a second, their eyes met. Recognition flickered, then something else, something darker. Regret, shame. Daniel swallowed hard. He crossed the street. Mark's gaze flickered to Lucky, nestled in Daniel's arms. "So, you're still alive," Mark rasped. His voice was rough, worn from too many cigarettes, too much time on the streets. Daniel nodded. "You?" Mark let out a dry chuckle. "Barely." Silence stretched between them. There were 1,000 things Daniel wanted to say, but none of them felt right. So instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the sandwich Maria had packed for him before he left. He handed it to Mark. Mark hesitated, then, with a muttered curse, he snatched it and tore into it like a starving man. Daniel sat down beside him, the cold seeping into his bones. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. A hard truth. Eventually, Mark slowed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He stared at the half-eaten sandwich like it was something foreign. "You got a job," he said finally. Daniel nodded. Mark scoffed. "Didn't think you had it in you." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Neither did I." Mark studied him. There was something unreadable in his expression. Then, with a tired sigh, he leaned his head back against the wall. "You ever think about going back?" he murmured. Daniel tensed. "Back where?" "You know where. The shelter. The system. The people who had tried to help them, only to fail over and over again." Daniel shook his head. "That life isn't for me." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, me neither." A beat of silence. Then Mark turned to him, his voice quieter. "But this life?" He gestured to the alley, the filth, the cold. "It'll eat you alive, man." Daniel looked down at Lucky, who was now fast asleep in his lap. "I know," he said. And that was why he had to keep going. For Lucky, for himself, for the chance that maybe, just maybe, this time, things would be different. The next morning, Daniel woke to the familiar ache in his bones, the exhaustion that came from a life spent running on empty. But today was different. Lucky was still asleep in his lap. And for a moment, Daniel allowed himself to enjoy the peace. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the soft chirp of birds greeting the new day, and the occasional clink of metal from the diner. The street was still mostly empty, the cool air crisp with the promise of a fresh start. But even in that moment of calm, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of his past. It had been a long time since he had felt truly safe. And now, with this fragile hope hanging by a thread, he wondered if he was just waiting for it all to fall apart again. Lucky stirred and yawned, stretching out on his lap before giving Daniel a soft nudge with his tiny nose. The puppy's warm eyes met his, as though asking him to push away the dark thoughts that clouded his mind. Daniel smiled weakly. "You're right, buddy. I'm thinking too much." He stood up carefully, stretching his stiff limbs before scooping Lucky into his arms. Today was the first day of his new life. He had to make it count. The struggle continues. The diner was buzzing with activity when Daniel arrived for his shift. And Maria was already in the thick of things. "Late again?" she asked with a raised eyebrow, though her voice held no malice. Daniel nodded quickly. "Sorry, just got caught up with Lucky." Maria's gaze softened for a moment, but then she shifted back into work mode. "You can't be late again, all right? You've got the job. Don't mess it up." Daniel nodded again. He could do this. For the next few hours, he focused only on the work in front of him, the clattering dishes, the steady rhythm of the grill, the constant hum of conversation around him. It was exhausting, but it was manageable. And for once, he didn't feel invisible. The routine was comforting in its simplicity. He did his best to stay out of Maria's way, but she was always watching, always observing. "Not bad, kid," she said after a particularly busy stretch. "You're keeping up, but don't get too cocky. This place can break you if you let it." Daniel swallowed. "I won't let it," he replied, his voice firm. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The weight of the past comes crashing down. By the end of his shift, Daniel was exhausted. He had pushed himself harder than usual, trying to prove something to Maria and to himself. But as he wiped down the counter, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He froze. It was a number he didn't recognize. His heart pounded as he answered. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Daniel, it's your brother." Daniel's blood ran cold. His brother. He hadn't heard from him in over 2 years. The last time they spoke, it had been ugly. He had left Daniel behind, abandoned him when the family fell apart. And now, after all this time, he was calling? "Why are you calling me?" Daniel's voice was tight, a knot forming in his chest. His brother's voice cracked. "I need your help." Daniel's mind raced. Help? After everything? The last thing he wanted was to get dragged back into the mess his family had created. "I don't think I can help you," Daniel replied, his voice steady but shaking on the inside. There was another pause. Then his brother spoke again, this time his voice full of desperation. "I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry for everything. I've screwed up. I know I hurt you. But I need you now. Please." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. "I can't fix this for you," Daniel said quietly. "I'm not the person I was back then. "You're all I have left," his brother said, voice cracking. Daniel's eyes burned, his chest tight with emotion. He didn't know how to fix the broken pieces of their past. He didn't know if he even wanted to. "I can't," Daniel repeated. "You made your choices. I made mine." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Because no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he was stronger, that he had moved on, the truth was that a part of him still longed for the family he had lost. A part of him still wanted to believe in the possibility of healing. But it was too late. His brother's voice faded out, a long silence stretching between them. "Goodbye, Daniel." And with that, the call ended. Daniel stood frozen in the empty diner, the weight of his brother's words still hanging in the air. Lucky whimpered softly in his arms, as if sensing his distress. Daniel closed his eyes, willing away the tears that threatened to fall. It wasn't fair, nothing was, but there was no going back. He could feel the old wounds tearing open, but there was nothing left to give. He had to keep moving forward. For Lucky, for himself, for the life he was building. Piece by piece, Daniel sat at the counter, his fingers gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles were white. His phone was still buzzing in his pocket, but he couldn't bring himself to check it. The weight of his brother's call, the sound of that broken voice pleading for help, it still lingered in his mind like a storm that wouldn't pass. Lucky, sensing his distress, crawled out of his lap and padded to the floor, nudging Daniel's leg with his soft, warm nose. It was a simple gesture, but one that grounded him in that moment. He looked down at the puppy, his eyes softening. Lucky was the only thing in the world that hadn't let him down. But even Lucky's innocence couldn't chase away the ache in his chest. For the past few years, Daniel had built walls around his heart. Walls to protect himself from the people who had abandoned him, from the family who had betrayed him, from the world that had shown him time and time again that trust was a dangerous thing. But with Lucky, it was different. He had opened himself up, little by little, and in return, he had received the kind of love he thought he would never feel again. Daniel rubbed his hand over his face, the weight of his emotions threatening to swallow him whole. But just as he was about to retreat into his thoughts again, a soft voice pulled him out of his spiral. "Hey, Daniel." He looked up. Maria stood by the kitchen door, wiping her hands on her apron. There was a softness in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that made him pause. "Yeah?" he replied, his voice hoarse. "You okay?" she asked, her tone casual, but there was something in the way she asked it that made him feel like she already knew the answer. Daniel hesitated, then gave a half-hearted shrug. "I don't know. I think I'm trying to figure it out." Maria stepped closer, her gaze flicking to Lucky, who was now curled up at his feet. "You're doing all right, Daniel. You've come a long way from where you were. I see it." Her words were simple, but they held weight, like a lifeline thrown his way. "I don't feel like I've come very far," he admitted quietly. Maria gave a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but trust me, you have. Look at how far you've come since that night you showed up here with nothing but your clothes and that dog in your arms. You've already done more than you realize." Her words resonated in his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt a flicker of something, hope. A fragile, but undeniable hope. "I don't know what I'm doing, Maria," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going." Maria's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Nobody does. But you're here, you're trying, and that's more than a lot of people can say." Daniel swallowed, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. "Thanks," he murmured, his heart swelling with something he couldn't name. Maria smiled. "You're welcome. And hey, don't let that brother of yours get to you. He's made his choices. You've made yours. You can't fix what's broken, but you can keep moving forward." The words hit him harder than he expected. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't need to fix everything. Maybe all he needed to do was keep moving. Keep surviving. For Lucky. For himself. By the time his shift ended, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the streets. The city felt different in the quiet hours of the evening, less chaotic. More personal. Daniel walked out of the diner with Lucky in his arms, the weight of the day still lingering but softened by the quiet comfort of the night. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a shot at something better. As he walked down the street, the neon lights flickering above him, Daniel made a silent promise to himself. He would keep moving, he would keep going, no matter how hard it got. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And with Lucky by his side, He knew he wouldn't have to do it alone. 2 weeks passed. Daniel's life didn't change overnight, but small things started to shift. He settled into a routine at the diner, finding a sense of rhythm in the work, the customers, the bustle. He felt a sense of pride in doing a job well, something he hadn't felt in years. Lucky thrived in the new routine, too. The little puppy had grown stronger, more playful, and the bond between them deepened. Daniel took him on long walks after his shifts, watching as Lucky ran ahead, his tail wagging with pure joy. The world still felt heavy at times. The weight of his past was always there, lurking in the corners of his mind, threatening to pull him under. But for now, Daniel had something to hold on to, something worth fighting for, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed were a mix of small victories and quiet battles. The cold, hard reality of life as a homeless man turned waiter didn't disappear. But it became manageable. It was as if, little by little, Daniel was piecing together a fragile puzzle of normalcy, one shift at a time. But no matter how many times he told himself that he had found a new rhythm, the past had a way of sneaking up on him. One particularly busy evening at the diner, the door swung open with a sharp jingle of bells, and Daniel's heart lurched. A familiar face walked in. It wasn't just any face. It was a face that had once been a source of warmth, of home. His mother. Daniel froze for a moment, the familiar ache rising in his chest. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even thought of her in months. The last time he spoke to her was on that fateful night when everything changed. When the world he thought he knew fell apart. Daniel? Her voice was tentative, unsure, as she stood just inside the door. He stood behind the counter, his breath catching. His stomach turned in knots, the emotions crashing through him like a wave. Maria noticed his reaction and glanced over at the woman standing by the door. Confusion in her eyes. "Hey, you okay?" Maria asked, but Daniel barely heard her. His mother stepped forward, her face etched with a combination of guilt and longing. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. She looked older, worn down by time and regret. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's world spun as he struggled to gather his thoughts. He couldn't believe she was standing there, not after everything that had happened, not after all the years of silence. "Daniel, his mother's voice trembled. "I've been looking for you. I want to make things right." Her words hit him like a slap. The desire for reconciliation, the hope that she could just erase the past and start over, it made his chest tight, and a storm of emotions rose within him. He had spent so long convincing himself that he didn't need her, that he didn't need anyone. But hearing her say that, hearing her say she wanted to fix things, made him question everything he had built. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. He couldn't speak. Lucky, sensing the tension in the air, let out a small whimper from the floor, looking up at Daniel with concerned eyes. The puppy padded over to his feet, nudging him gently. The sound of the puppy's soft whine seemed to break the trance. "Mom?" Daniel's voice cracked as he finally found the words. "I don't know what you want from me. After everything, I don't know if I can trust you again." She flinched at his words, but he couldn't bring himself to soften them. The hurt from years of abandonment, of being left to face the world alone, still stung like an open wound. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've changed, Daniel. I'm not that woman anymore. I don't want to lose you." Daniel's mind was a whirlwind. He couldn't deny the longing that bubbled up inside him, the longing to hear those words from her, to believe that she could truly change. But deep down, he knew better. The hurt was too deep, the betrayal too strong. He had learned the hard way that people didn't change. "You can't just come back into my life like nothing happened," he said, his voice more forceful now. "You can't just erase all the years of silence and pain. It doesn't work like that." His mother's eyes welled up with tears, and she took a step closer. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I know I can't undo the past. But I want to try, Daniel. I want to be there for you. Please." He shook his head, the emotions surging within him. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, all of it came to a head in that moment. "You don't get to just walk in here and make everything better. You left me, Mom. You left me with nothing. I don't need you to fix anything. I'm fine." He swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Lucky whimpered softly again, sensing the growing tension in the room. Maria, who had been silently watching the exchange, stepped forward. "Look, I don't know what's been going on between you two, but this isn't the place for this conversation. Daniel's working, and right now, he's trying to keep things together." Daniel glanced at Maria, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Her words were like a breath of fresh air in the suffocating silence. His mother seemed to understand, stepping back, though the pain in her eyes remained. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make things harder for you." Daniel stood still for a moment, unable to look at her. The emotions churned inside him like a violent storm. "I'll think about what you said," he muttered, barely audible. With that, his mother turned and left, the door jingling behind her. Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak as he watched her go. For the first time, he realized he wasn't sure if he wanted to rebuild that bridge. The foundation was cracked beyond repair, and he wasn't sure if it was worth trying to fix it. That night, after closing, Daniel sat on the curb outside the diner with Lucky nestled at his feet. He stared out into the street, the neon lights flickering in the distance. The night was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He thought about his mother, about the years of waiting for something, anything, that might make sense of the mess they had left behind. But now, as he sat there, with Lucky by his side, he realized something. He didn't need his mother to feel whole. He didn't need anyone else to complete him. He had survived. He had made it this far. And though the pain of his past still lingered, he had built a new life. A life that was his own. And with Lucky by his side, he felt stronger than ever. He didn't know what the future held, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He would face whatever came, step by step, and he would keep moving forward. Because, no matter how hard it got, he had something worth fighting for. And that something was right there at his feet, wagging his tail in the moonlight. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself in a strange limbo. His mother's sudden appearance had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Yet, it wasn't the raw anger or bitterness that lingered, it was something deeper, something harder to face, the loneliness. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long, even amidst the noisy, bustling life of the city. Lucky had been a source of solace in the midst of that silence. His puppy, his constant shadow, seemed to understand the complexity of the emotions Daniel couldn't even put into words. The bond they shared was different from anything Daniel had ever known. It was more than companionship, it was a lifeline. Each day, after the last customer had left the diner and the lights flickered off, Daniel and Lucky would make their way to the quiet bench behind the diner. It had become their spot, a space where the noise of the world would fade into the background, and all that mattered was the warmth of Lucky's fur against his side. It was there, under the dim glow of the streetlights, that Daniel would finally let the weight of the day fall away. His guard, built from years of heartbreak, would slip, just a little. He would close his eyes and let the quiet hum of the world around him be a comfort, not a threat. Lucky would rest his head on Daniel's lap, his soft eyes looking up at him with trust and devotion, a silent promise that they were in this together. One evening, as the crisp air of autumn began to settle into the night, Daniel sat on the bench, his hand running through Lucky's fur. The usual stillness of the moment was broken by the distant sound of footsteps. At first, Daniel thought nothing of it, but then he saw the shadow of a figure in the distance. It was a man, older than Daniel by a few years, dressed in tattered clothes that spoke of a life lived on the streets. His gait was slow, worn, as if each step had been taken 1,000 times before. He looked lost, his eyes glazed over in a way that reminded Daniel of the version of himself he had been not too long ago. The man approached the bench, his gaze flickering toward Daniel before it landed on Lucky, who was still curled up at his feet. "Is that your dog?" the man asked, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used much in recent days. Daniel looked up, startled by the question. "Yeah," he answered, his voice guarded. The man gave a small smile, but there was something heavy behind it. "He's a good dog. They say dogs can save people, you know?" The man took a seat on the far end of the bench, his weary body settling into the worn wood. Daniel said nothing at first, unsure of how to respond. The man's words seemed to hang in the air, tugging at something deep within him. "I used to have a dog," the man continued, his voice quieter now. "Had him for years. He was my only friend. His name was Rocky. He never left my side, not once. Not even when the world told me I didn't matter." Daniel's chest tightened as he listened, the rawness of the man's voice speaking to a part of him he had long buried. Lucky, sensing the shift in the air, lifted his head and moved toward the stranger. His tail wagging hesitantly, the man smiled at Lucky's sudden affection, a tear escaping from his eye. "Rocky, he passed away a few months back," he said, his voice breaking. "Cancer. But before that, he was always there for me. He never judged me, never turned his back." Daniel's eyes softened, he could see the grief in the man's expression, the silent pain of loss that mirrored his own. He understood it all too well, the loneliness, the aching emptiness that only those who had lost something precious could truly comprehend. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I know how you feel." The man turned to him, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue in them. "You know what it's like, huh? To lose someone you love. To be left with nothing but memories in empty space." Daniel nodded slowly, his heart heavy. "Yeah, I do." They sat there for a while, the two of them, strangers in a way, but also connected by the same invisible thread of pain. The silence between them was no longer awkward, it was understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of the scars they both carried. Finally, the man stood up, his body stiff from age and exhaustion. He gave Lucky one last pat on the head before turning to leave. "Take care of that dog of yours," he said, his voice softer now. "They're more than just pets, you know. They're lifelines." Daniel watched the man walk away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the night. He sat still for a few moments, the words hanging in the air long after the man was gone. Lucky looked up at Daniel, his eyes bright and trusting. Daniel leaned down, brushing a hand through his fur. "You're right," Daniel whispered, more to himself than to the puppy. "You really are a lifeline." The next few days passed in a blur of work and quiet moments. The shadows of the past continued to hover, but they didn't seem as threatening anymore. Daniel was slowly coming to terms with the fact that he could move forward, that his past didn't have to define him. But the visit from the stranger had left a mark. It made him realize just how much he had come to depend on Lucky, how much of his world had become intertwined with the small, comforting presence of the puppy at his side. It was an unspoken truth, Lucky had become more than just a companion. He was Daniel's anchor. One evening, as Daniel finished his shift, he made his way outside, where the cool breeze whispered through the trees. Lucky was waiting for him, as usual, wagging his tail excitedly. But this time, there was something different about the way he looked at Daniel. Something more than just the joy of a dog waiting for its owner. It was as though Lucky understood. He understood the weight of Daniel's past and the burden he carried. And, more importantly, he understood the unspoken promise between them. They would face whatever came next, together. Daniel bent down and scooped Lucky into his arms, holding him close, feeling the warmth of the puppy's body against his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be okay. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he wasn't alone anymore. And that was all that mattered. Daniel's world, which had been dark and filled with hollow echoes of what once was, began to change. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but rather like a slow dawn, creeping in with soft whispers of light, revealing the things he had never dared to look at before. And none of this transformation had been possible without Lucky. But as the days passed, a new fear began to gnaw at Daniel's heart, an unshakable feeling that he was, in some ways, too dependent on the puppy. Lucky had become his protector, his source of stability. In return, Daniel had promised to take care of him, but it was never just about the physical needs. He knew that it was about more than just food and shelter. It was about the emotional bond that had taken root so quickly, so deeply. But then, as if by fate's cruel design, Daniel found himself faced with a question he had tried to avoid for so long. What would happen when he couldn't protect Lucky? What would he do when the inevitable moment arrived where he would fail the one creature who had never let him down? He didn't have the answer. It was an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind where the world felt as if it was standing still, each minute stretching into another without purpose or meaning. The sky was overcast, clouds heavy with the promise of rain that never came. Daniel stood behind the diner, glancing at his watch, the moments ticking by like the drumming of a distant storm. Lucky was lying on the ground, rolling onto his back in the dirt, his tiny paws batting at the air. He was so carefree, so full of life, Daniel couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was rare for him to find moments of peace like this, moments where the world felt almost perfect. Where the noise and pain of the past could be kept at bay, if only for a little while. But as he turned to gather his things and head inside for his shift, the sound of a car engine broke through the stillness. Daniel looked up instinctively, his heart skipping a beat. The vehicle was unfamiliar, a black SUV parked near the alleyway behind the diner. It wasn't a place where cars usually stopped, and something about the vehicle made him uneasy. The door to the SUV opened, and a tall man stepped out. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but there was something about his posture that radiated authority, like a person who was used to having control. He didn't look like he belonged in this part of the city. "Hey," the man called out, his voice low and calm. Daniel's stomach twisted as he hesitated, unsure of what was happening. The man looked at him, a smile playing on his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You Daniel, right?" Daniel nodded cautiously, trying to keep his distance as the man took a step closer. "Yeah, I am. Can I help you with something?" The man took a slow breath, his eyes scanning the street before settling back on Daniel. "I'm here about the dog. Lucky." Daniel's heart skipped in his chest, the blood draining from his face. "What about him?" His voice was shaky despite his best efforts to remain calm. The man's smile faded, replaced by a businesslike expression. "I'm here to take him. It's time." Daniel froze, his body tensing as his mind raced. "Take him? Time? What was this man talking about?" "I don't understand," Daniel said, his voice growing more firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "What do you mean, take him?" The man's gaze hardened, but there was a certain coldness in his eyes now, as though he had expected this reaction. He folded his arms across his chest and took a step closer. "Lucky is a valuable asset. You see, we have a contract, a legally binding agreement that says Lucky is to be placed with a more appropriate owner. Someone who can give him what he needs." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his breath becoming shallow. The words didn't make sense. Contract? He was the one who found Lucky, the one who had raised him, protected him, loved him. What right did this man have to take him away? "There's been some confusion," the man continued, his voice softer now. "But we've come to a resolution. The paperwork is all sorted. It's time for Lucky to go with us." Lucky, sensing the sudden shift in the air, stood up from where he had been playing and trotted over to Daniel. His tail wagged innocently, oblivious to the tension that was now filling the space. He nuzzled Daniel's leg, and Daniel instinctively bent down to rub his fur, feeling the warmth of the little puppy's affection. But this wasn't right, something was wrong. Daniel stood taller, blocking the man from getting any closer to Lucky. His heart raced, and he could feel the blood pumping in his ears. He didn't know what this man wanted, but it didn't matter. Lucky was his dog, and no one was taking him away. "I don't know who you are, but you're not taking him," Daniel said firmly. His voice shook, but there was a determination in his eyes that the man could see. The man paused for a moment, as though sizing him up. Then, with a sigh, he shook his head, an almost pitying expression crossing his face. "You're not understanding. Lucky belongs to us. The law is on our side." The words felt like a slap to Daniel's face. The law? His thoughts were a blur as the man continued to speak, but Daniel barely registered the words. All he could focus on was the image of Lucky, his puppy, his companion, standing beside him, unaware of the storm swirling around them. But before Daniel could respond, before he could voice the turmoil that was rising in him like a tidal wave, Lucky suddenly growled. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, deep and menacing. Lucky's posture stiffened, and his eyes narrowed as he stood protectively between Daniel and the man. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Lucky was never aggressive. He had never once shown any sign of hostility, not toward anyone. But now he was standing his ground. The man's eyes flickered briefly with surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device that gleamed ominously in the light. Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward, reaching for Lucky, shielding him with his body. The sudden fear that washed over him was like nothing he had ever felt before. The only thing he knew in that moment was that he would do anything at all, to protect his puppy from whatever this man had planned. "I don't care about your contract," Daniel growled, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not taking him. You'll have to go through me first." And just like that, everything changed. The man didn't flinch, but his lips curled into a thin, almost amused smile. He seemed unfazed by Daniel's defiance, as though it were all part of the plan. The device in his hand glinted ominously, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a random tool, it was something designed to be used on Lucky. But what was it? "Daniel," the man began, his tone calm, almost patronizing. "You don't understand. This isn't about you. This is about what's best for the dog. You can't provide him with what he needs. We can." Daniel's blood boiled at his words. What Lucky needs? How dare he? Lucky needed love. He needed care. He needed someone who saw him for the soul that he was. He didn't need a contract or some faceless corporation trying to take him away from the only home he'd ever known. "I won't let you take him," Daniel said again, his voice sharp, though the fear gnawed at his insides. He had no idea who this man was or why he thought he had any right to take Lucky, but the puppy's growl intensified. And Daniel's resolve hardened. Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was family. The man stared at him for a moment longer, then sighed and lowered the device. His posture shifted, as though he had decided to shift tactics. "You really think you can stand in our way?" he asked, his voice now tinged with something darker, colder. "You're nothing but a homeless nobody. No money, no connections, no power." He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning Daniel's worn clothing and the crumbling street behind him. "What are you going to do when the system comes for you? When it takes everything you have?" Daniel swallowed hard. The man's words cut deep, as though he were striking at the very core of his existence. It wasn't just about Lucky. It was about everything Daniel had worked for, the scraps of stability he had fought so hard to hold on to. Every decision he made was a battle. Every day was a struggle. And now this man, with his shiny suit and cold eyes, was reminding him just how little power he had. But then, he felt a gentle nudge at his side, a soft push of warm fur against his leg. Lucky, his little puppy, was leaning against him, staring up at the man with a look of unwavering loyalty. And in that moment, something shifted inside Daniel. The man's words had dug deep, but they had also reminded him of what he truly had in this world, a bond that was unbreakable, something far stronger than anything the man could take away from him. "I don't care about your system," Daniel said, the words coming out with a strength he didn't even know he had. "You won't break me. You won't break him." The man's expression faltered for the briefest moment. It was as if Daniel had thrown a wrench in whatever plan he had. He took a step back, his hand tightening around the device in his pocket. For a second, it felt like time stood still, the world holding its breath. The air around them seemed thick with unspoken tension, like something was about to snap. Then the man spoke again. But this time, his voice was low and foreboding. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. This won't end well. You think you're saving him, but you're only prolonging the inevitable. There's nothing you can do to stop what's coming." Daniel's mind raced as he took in the man's words. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to shout, to scream at this stranger who had just waltzed into his life with threats and promises. But Lucky's soft whimper pulled him out of his head, grounding him in the present. The puppy was still by his side, his eyes wide with uncertainty, as though he could sense the danger in the air. Lucky's tail flicked anxiously, and Daniel's heart clenched at the sight. He crouched down, pulling the little puppy close and cradling him in his arms. "No matter what," Daniel whispered to him, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm never letting anyone take you away. You're my family. You're the reason I wake up every day." The man eyed him one last time, his gaze lingering on the pair before he turned to leave. His steps measured and slow. "This isn't over, Daniel. You've made a dangerous enemy today. We'll be back, you'll see." As he climbed back into the SUV, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. His mind screamed with questions. Who was this man? What had he meant by "we"? And why was Lucky so important to them? It wasn't long before Daniel began to piece together the fragments of information that had been scattered in that brief encounter. He couldn't let it go. His mind wouldn't stop racing. There was more to this than just some random stranger trying to take Lucky. The man had spoken with authority, as if he had a larger organization behind him. An organization that wanted something from Lucky. And the more Daniel thought about it, the more certain he became that there was a hidden truth that he hadn't yet uncovered. But it didn't matter. No matter what the man's motives were, Daniel was going to fight for Lucky. For as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would protect his puppy. That night, after his shift ended and he returned to the alley behind the diner, he sat down on the cold concrete, Lucky nestled comfortably in his lap. They stared at the city lights, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to truly breathe. The fear hadn't left him. It would never truly leave him. But in this moment, as he felt the warmth of Lucky's little body curled against his chest, Daniel realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. No matter what the world threw at him, he would never face it alone. And as long as Lucky was by his side, there was nothing he couldn't overcome. The man in the suit? He could try to break him all he wanted. But Daniel had something far stronger than fear, love. And it was unshakable. Days passed, but the heavy feeling of impending danger never fully left Daniel. He tried to go on with his routine, working long shifts, doing what he could to keep himself and Lucky safe, but the shadow of the man's threat lingered in his mind. Gnawing at him, every time someone passed by, every time a car slowed down near the alley, Daniel's heart would race with the fear that they were coming for him. For Lucky, but he couldn't show fear. Not now, not when the bond between him and his puppy had grown stronger with every passing day. Lucky's presence had given Daniel something he never thought he'd have again: hope. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. That was until the day they came. It started with the sound of a car's tires screeching to a halt in front of the alley. A sudden jolt that broke Daniel from his thoughts. He was sitting against the wall, Lucky's head resting on his knee, when the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the quiet street. He stood up quickly, holding Lucky close to his chest, his body tensing with fear. But this time, it wasn't just one man. There were several, figures in dark suits, their faces shadowed by the low light, walking in a deliberate, almost predatory manner toward him. Daniel, the man from before, spoke, his voice colder now, more final. "We warned you this would happen. You've made your choice, and now, you'll have to face the consequences." Daniel felt a chill in his bones, his grip tightening on Lucky. The puppy whimpered, sensing the danger. But this time, Daniel couldn't run. He wouldn't run, not when Lucky needed him the most. "You'll have to go through me first," Daniel said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering in his chest. The man sneered, a cruel smile crossing his lips. "That's the problem, Daniel. You think you're protecting him. But you're not. We can offer him a future you never could. A life that's safe, where he doesn't have to live in this filth." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had lived on the streets for years, fought tooth and nail just to survive, and in that time, Lucky had been his reason to keep going. His family, but the man's words felt like a knife in his gut. Could Lucky have a better life somewhere else? Did he deserve better than this alley? The thought tortured him, but then he looked down at Lucky, who was looking up at him with those trusting eyes, his tail wagging gently despite the tension in the air. Lucky wasn't scared, and neither was Daniel. He knew, deep down, that this was the right thing. He wasn't going to give up on his puppy, not now, not ever. The man took another step closer, pulling something from his jacket pocket, another device, this one glinting under the streetlight. It looked like something that could immobilize a dog, some sort of tool to control Lucky. Without thinking, Daniel sprang forward, putting himself between the man and Lucky. He didn't care about the man's threats, didn't care about the fear in his heart. He was ready to fight, but before the man could react, a loud sound filled the air, a sharp, piercing whistle, cutting through the tension like a blade. And then, from the darkness of the alley, a loud bark echoed. The man stopped dead in his tracks, eyes widening. What the? A figure emerged from the shadows. Not another suit-wearing figure, but something far more unexpected, a dog. A large, muscular Rottweiler, its fur gleaming in the dim light, standing between Daniel and the man, teeth bared in a protective snarl. "Stay back," a voice commanded. It was a woman's voice, strong, determined. The figure stepped forward, her face now visible. She was dressed in a dark jacket, her eyes sharp and focused, and she moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. The man hesitated, clearly unsettled by the sudden appearance of this new player. His hand tightened around the device, but the Rottweiler growled louder, its stance unwavering. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded, his voice betraying his surprise. The woman didn't flinch. "I'm the one who's going to stop you from taking that dog." Daniel's confusion deepened, but the woman's presence was a force to be reckoned with. The Rottweiler stepped closer to Daniel, as though ensuring that he remained safe. Its eyes never leaving the man. "What are you talking about?" Daniel asked, his mind racing. Who was this woman, and why was she protecting him? The woman's eyes softened slightly as she glanced at Daniel, then back at the man. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her tone more personal now. "You think you're protecting Lucky, but he's been marked. He's not just a dog, Daniel. He's a part of something bigger. Something much bigger than both of you." Daniel's heart dropped. "What are you saying? What's going on here?" The woman took a breath, stepping forward, her Rottweiler moving with her. "Lucky's not just any dog. He's part of a program that's been tracking certain animals with unique capabilities. He's more than you know." Daniel's head was spinning. He didn't understand, but there was something in her voice that told him she wasn't lying. Lucky had been marked? For what? The man scoffed, his patience thinning. "This is pointless. You think you can stop us?" But before he could react, the Rottweiler lunged, snapping at the air in front of him. The man stepped back, realizing that the woman wasn't playing games. The woman spoke again, but this time, her voice was final. "You're not going to take him, not while I'm here. And you'll regret underestimating me." For a moment, silence filled the air. And then, slowly, the man turned, the threat in his eyes still present, but his resolve faltering. He didn't speak, but he knew when the fight wasn't worth it. He nodded to his team, and they retreated, leaving Daniel, Lucky, and the mysterious woman standing in the alley, the tension finally ebbing away. As the last of the figures disappeared into the night, Daniel turned to the woman, his voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" She smiled, though there was sadness in her eyes. "I'm someone who's been watching over him for a long time, and I'm sorry it had to come to this. But I promise you, Daniel, Lucky has a purpose. A bigger purpose, and he's going to need your help to fulfill it." Daniel's mind was reeling, but all he could focus on was the warm weight of Lucky in his arms, his heartbeat steady, his fur soft against Daniel's skin. No matter what came next, he would fight for him. They would face whatever challenge lay ahead together. Because no matter what the world had planned for Lucky, he was Daniel's puppy. And nothing, no one, could change that.